Hello and welcome to this election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. This has without a doubt been one of the nastiest presidential races in modern U.S. history. But with the debates behind us and Election Day fast approaching, it's crunch time for all the candidates. Today we're discussing the debates, the state of the race, and the home stretch to Election Day. With me today are Paybarah, Senior Reporter for Politico New York, Jarrett Murphy, Executive Editor and Publisher of City Limits, and Jeff Mays, political reporter at DNA Info New York. Gentlemen, so the debates are behind us. We're looking ahead, crunch time, home stretch. What are some takeaways from either the final debate or all the debates together? I'll start with just one thing that really stuck out to me in the third debate was just sort of the way that Donald Trump started the debate and finished the debate, right? And when he was answering the first question about the Supreme Court, one of the first things that he said was about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg had said nasty things about him, right? So this is Donald Trump, right? He's never going to let a slight go by. So that's how he sort of kicked off the debate. And then at the end of the debate, he finished his closing statement by talking about if you want 4 more years of Barack Obama, vote for her, right? Or if you want to avoid that, don't. And he, again, continued to sort of make his campaign both about attacks and about Barack Obama, where I think a lot of us recognize the genesis of his campaign came from. So those are a couple takeaways from me. What about you guys? Ozzy?
I sort of thought his amazing remark about not accepting the results was the clearest evidence that the third debate was actually the opening credits for the Trump show, which is what sort of this entire campaign has really been about. It's been about him. He hasn't been about electing Republicans. He hasn't been about building a party. He hasn't really, if you think about it, really been ideologically consistent enough to be about building a movement. No. You know, he's spoken about anger, and he really hasn't laid out any specific policy or realistic policy for it. But the only thing he's done is consume all the oxygen in any room he's walked in, which overshadows legitimate questions about Hillary Clinton. So Donald Trump has made the election about Donald Trump, and he's made, November 8th or 28th, whatever he thinks the election date is, he's made that the starting point for whatever he wants to do afterwards.
I thought, I've always lived by the idea that what occurs in Las Vegas stays in Vegas, so it's difficult for me to talk about this. But, in terms of legitimate questions for Hillary Clinton, I thought this debate was in some ways the most substantive. It started with policy, it stayed focused on different policy areas throughout. I did think that the selection of questions had a Fox News bent. I thought that starting with the Supreme Court, which has become the kind of last redoubt of the evangelicals hoping to maintain support for Trump, the phrasing of the question around the economy, Ms. Clinton, your plan calls for higher taxes, more government spending and entitlements. Donald Trump, you want to cut taxes and end regulation. Which of your plans is better? And ending the debate talking about the most important issue being the national debt without ever mentioning climate change was kind of extraordinary. During the actual asking those questions, though, I thought Wallace did a decent job keeping people on task. And for that reason, I think it was the debate where Trump's performance was weakest of the three. That was one of my takeaways anyway.
I mean, after the battering that Trump has taken these past few weeks, his taxes to sexual assaulting women or accusations of doing so, he really needed a knockout performance in this debate. He needed to show some sort of poise, that he was under control, that his sole response to criticism wouldn't be, sort of juvenile snapbacks and criticisms. And he really failed at that last night, I thought. I thought he was easily baited by Hillary Clinton on several different occasions. She was able to just make him angry on several different points, and then that he got away from his points and wasn't able to make that clear that, hey, I have a clear policy on a lot of issues. I have ideas, as has been the whole campaign. He has not shown, I think, compared to Clinton, that he will be able to propose his ideas and see them through to the finish.
What do we know now with, limited days before the vote, 3 debates behind us, lots of campaigning? What do we know about some of the biggest differences in their policy, their approach, let's say, to the Supreme Court? What do we think we know? And I'll add a caveat to that, which is that, as Ozzy alluded to, and Jeff, you just said, I don't think we have a full grasp of what he really believes. I don't think that that's clear, because every time he puts forward a position, we often find something from anywhere between 6 months ago and 20 years ago where he was saying something very different. So with that caveat, what do we think we know about some of the biggest policy differences here?
One of the starkest policy differences is his desire to sort of have the United States play a smaller role on the world stage, and he's actually made Hillary Clinton like more hawkish on that. He's questioned, or he's actually touted, the Soviet Union and as being a good force for fighting ISIS, and he sort of pointed to some of the worst actors on the international stage as our best allies in preventing terrorism. And Hillary Clinton has demonstrated, she had this remarkable line that when she was in the Situation Room, he was doing The Apprentice, and that sort of lays out the overall idea that she, whether or not she's more hawkish than some Democrats and progressives would like, she at least has the experience, and he doesn't.
Some people have talked about him sort of, in many ways, being stuck in the 90s, even the 80s, right? And his sort of New York City, and even the way he describes cities. Now, we have seen some increases in violence in some cities around the country, for sure, but even the way he talks about inner cities and the way he talks about dictators is a very sort of old style.
He talks about everything in black and white terms, and it's remarkable. When you mention African Americans, the first thing he does is talks about inner cities and crime, as if that's the only place where African Americans live, and that's the only issue that's facing them. In his worldview, everything is black and white and very clear. And on a presidential debate, you would be able to express some more nuance than what he's been able to do.
Yeah, it's clear, and it's also very one-dimensional. I think what we know is that we still don't know, and he probably doesn't know. You take immigration, which was maybe his sort of signature issue when he took the scene last year. The word now is that we're going to build this wall, we're going to throw out the criminal aliens, and then at that point we'll make a determination about the millions and millions of people who remain. And obviously that is, the number of people you would actually deport on the criminal line would be relatively modest compared to this. And he has provided absolutely no detail about how he would actually accomplish that. And that's just one of several examples. And it's remarkable to have a race where it's almost sort of pure id, in that people really are responding to broad signals, dog whistles, and so little focus on the actual mechanics of policy, which probably in some ways has been to Trump's advantage, and might be to his disadvantage were he to actually win.
And we have to acknowledge, of course, that he's tapped into some real sentiments, right? From real resentment in places, some that borders on bigotry and racism and misogyny, but others that tap into real economic struggle, right? And he's really, hit those notes.
I mean, the problem I see with Trump is that he mastered the showmanship part of being a politician, but he hasn't learned some of the more practical aspects, like explaining your position well, or even pivoting, for example. When they talked about debate, and Hillary Clinton was very strongly defending her stance on late-term abortion, whereas in the past, Donald Trump has been a supporter of a woman's right to choose, but he wasn't able to explain what happened. Why did his position shift? You look at President Obama on gay marriage, he was able to give you a narrative of how he came to eventually support it, although he originally was against it. And Trump hasn't learned that, and that's part of the problem. He hasn't been able to explain to voters, here's my position, here's why I feel that way. Too much stuck in the showmanship, and lack of substance is missing.
On foreign policy, let's stick with that for a minute. Ozzy said, Trump wants the U.S. to play a smaller role on the world stage. Let's compare them a little bit. I mean, what does it seem like we know? Trump wants to reevaluate trade deals. He wants to reevaluate alliances. He thinks the U.S. has been getting ripped off. Hillary Clinton has been an interventionist. Where does it seem like they fall now? What's the choice here for voters?
Well, the only real place where they've talked in detail is about Syria. And there it's telling that at the vice presidential debate, both candidates expressed a desire to see protected zones, safe havens. I don't think anyone used the term no-fly zone, but that was implied. Trump backed it up quite a bit, retreated from that stance quite a bit. Clinton has been, I think, a little more careful about saying exactly what she wanted to see happen there. But I think that neither of them have any. To some degree, the Iraq thing is fascinating, right? Because he denies that he supported the war, although he's on tape saying he supported it. Clinton did support the war, has said that it was a mistake. Neither of them want to have a U.S. ground presence there. Trump is very upset with how the attack on Mosul has been packaged, critiquing the generals on that. Clinton obviously supports that approach. I think in the end, what's interesting is that when you come down to it, the line between intervention and the lack of it, when you're not starting from a clean slate. You have the situation of ISIS, you have American advisors on the ground. When you have intervention that's at that scale, really pretty much out of the view of the American public on a day-to-day basis, I think any president is unlikely to deviate from that very much, in the moment of January 20th and thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Hillary Clinton had a real weakness in this area as a former Secretary of State. There were lots of policy decisions that you could have picked on her about. The Iraq War, as you mentioned, for example, he wasn't able to really pound that home and explain to voters what she did wrong, what she actually did wrong, and then more importantly, what he would do different. Mm-hmm. He talks about Syria and how it's so bad and it's going wrong there, and Aleppo is a mess. But last night, I didn't hear him propose any sort of way how he would handle that differently. And I think he missed a real opportunity there because she had some weaknesses that he could have exposed and really drilled home, but he didn't really go far enough.
The only line that he really stuck with that rang out to me was the idea that ISIS has grown so much during Obama's tenure, and at one point he said, like, you created it, which when he first said that line, I was stunned. I said, oh my God, he's going back to that line again. Mm-hmm. And then he actually amazingly expressed some slight understanding of policy by saying, like, you created the vacuum by which this thing happened. Now they're in 32 countries. And his only response to it was, we'll beat them. And you were there when it grew. And for some voters who don't appreciate, how complex the geopolitical stage can be, that's enough of a reason to sort of question what she's done there. Now that she hasn't been in office in 4 years, she wasn't part of the second term. And Trump has said, to some alarm, that he would use his power to not only keep Guantanamo Bay open, which is where some people are being held when they're captured on the battlefield, but that he would even go beyond that and have the Justice Department, in terms of domestic matters, investigate Hillary Clinton for any number of issues. And he expresses this type of unilateral use of power without, without demonstrating he understands the limits of what that can do. It's not clear, what terrorist organizations, how they would react to a guy whose only strategy is to be a strongman.
And I think, too, it betrays that his experience in interpersonal relations is across the table from a potential business partner. Mm-hmm. And the world doesn't work that way. Iran is a perfect example. He rails against the Iranian nuclear deal. He rails against Iran. Iran is one of the biggest opponents of ISIS. And we have, in places in Iraq and elsewhere, a sort of wink-wink, nod-nod alliance with Iran fighting ISIS, because that's kind of how it works. His answers kind of they collapsed into themselves on that, because he'd be talking about fighting ISIS, then talking about Syria's role fighting ISIS, and Iran being a supporter of Syria in that regard, and never connecting those two. It's a complicated place, and he's not a complicated man.
Right, he doesn't do nuance well, and I think Jeff and you guys are really hitting on an interesting thing with him that I think also speaks to his standing in sort of the national polls and the national imagination, which is that there's a certain number of people clearly in the country who really like his toughness and the basics of what he's saying, but he can't quite bust through that ceiling because he's then not offering enough on the other side, right? He's got some of the strong, simple critiques that make a lot of sense to people, but then where is your vision for moving forward? And ISIS is a pretty good example of that, where he has sort of defaulted now to saying, well, it's foolish to tell your plan ahead of time. And that sort of makes some sense to people, right, in terms of strategy, but it's also like, well, we need to hear a little bit of a framework.
Well, I think he didn't really take advantage of this disenchantment that's going on right now. The other day, he gave a speech where he talked about congressional term limits, and it was the best I think I've heard him sound in the entire campaign. He made a lot of sense. He talked about why term limits were necessary, what happens when there aren't term limits. So you can only imagine if his campaign had been more along those lines. I mean, such a powerful issue that hits home with a lot of people where there's a lot of disenchantment with U.S. government right now. That's a strong point. He sounded good. He laid out the policy. It made sense to a lot of people.
I agree with you, and I think when he says in these debates, you've been on this political public stage for 30 years, why haven't you advanced some of these ideas, or why haven't you made some of this happen? Of course, a U.S. senator can't unilaterally pass laws, but it's, to me, a fairly effective line of communication, and if he stuck with the outsider versus insider in a more disciplined fashion, he'd probably be in a better place.
That soundbite, it sounds appealing, but when you look at it upon it, when you give it any kind of examination, it sort of falls apart. The reason why Hillary Clinton and Democrats, in the White House weren't able to do as much as they wanted was because of Republican opposition. It wasn't for a lack of ideas. It wasn't for, as we've seen in the New York State Senate, infighting among Democrats about what to do. It was literally a Tea Party caucus, the tail wagging the dog of the Republican caucus, not allowing, John Boehner to really make the deals that he sort of wanted to do. And to blame Hillary Clinton for not doing more is sort of ironic, especially when you consider when she was a senator, Republicans had put out a memo basically saying, stop working with her because she was reaching across the aisle and finding bipartisan issues to work on. Among them, with Newt Gingrich, who's now a big Trump supporter, digitizing medical records so people can more easily access healthcare and communicate with their doctors. So there's a history that she has of reaching across the aisle, finding things that'll work, but the lack of attention on who exactly is causing this problem, and the idea that he's proposing term limits, it comes at the tail end of the campaign after a number of lawmakers have said, we're not going to support you in light of this Access Hollywood tape. I mean, it seems more like revenge than actually a thought-out policy.
Or actually, it's kind of nostalgic in a way, because his first foray into presidential politics was briefly in 2000, I think, when he made to run on the Reform Party line. Ross Perot, term limits, I mean, that was the heart of that critique, was that we need a businessman's sensibility, professional politicians can't get it done, we need to curtail power. That probably is his political heart. His decision to run as a Republican in a party that is increasingly conservative kind of, in a way, forced him to adopt or not adopt positions in a lot of issue areas where clearly he's just not that comfortable, doesn't have the expertise, doesn't have the lingo, may even not even have a lot of real genuine sentiment. So maybe he's sort of going back to who he really is politically, but it probably is too late. And I think that, again, probably some upset. He's upset at the establishment now, regardless of what party, because a lot of the establishment is abandoning him, or at least, sort of arm's length approach.
But the political motivations notwithstanding, I just thought that the term limit was just an example of him actually proposing a policy, explaining it. Here's why, and it was actually a policy that probably hits home with a lot of Americans. When it comes to African Americans, Hillary Clinton is vulnerable. She called young black men super predators. Why isn't he pounding her on that instead of saying my African American, or as you said, discussing crime? Last night he said you go to the store, you get shot. That's not true. That's nonsense. He had an opportunity to say, here are some real solid proposals that I believe will help African Americans. Instead, he squandered that opportunity. He didn't hit Hillary Clinton where she's clearly vulnerable in lots of different places.
And the one part of the debate that had me sort of banging my head against the table was when he pointed to Chicago and said, there's gun control, they have strict gun control laws and they have a crime problem. Obviously, gun control doesn't solve crime. And it's incredibly ironic that the guy who wants to build a wall on the Mexican border doesn't understand that guns travel across borders. I just can't get over that.
Yes, that was a head-scratching moment.
So I want to talk about Hillary Clinton a little bit more, because obviously, like the rest of the country, we're very focused on Donald Trump, and for good reason. He's less of a known quantity, and he's inflammatory and all these things. But before we get to Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump did say in the third debate he's not sure if he'll concede if he loses, right? He's not sure that he'll acknowledge the validity of the results. He'll look at it later, he'll leave you in suspense. Again, TV showman, but this is real stuff, and he's got a lot of followers who are already taking up his lines about it being a rigged election before it even really started. What's going on here? Do we have anything to worry about? His spokesperson in the media, his campaign manager, immediately after the debate said, he's going to concede if he loses, but he hasn't said it, and he said all along, nobody speaks for me.
And even if he does say it afterwards, he may have set in motion something that he can't control. I mean, I think that is, I have to agree with Clinton, that is a horrifying thing to contemplate. I think people are worried about, acts of violence, intimidation at the polls. I think that the point that I would keep in mind is that this is Trump's spin on a long-time strategy in the conservative movement to delegitimize parts of the voter pool. They understand that the demographics in this country are working against them, and there have been policy efforts on a number of fronts, statewide and national, voter ID laws, felon disenfranchisement, to try to thwart a majority that's moving away from them. And this is merely that effort on steroids. And so Trump is putting a Trumpian spin on it. It's frightening because of what we've seen at the rallies and stuff. But it's certainly not something that he concocted by himself.
I think it's interesting to see Pence and Trump's spokesperson immediately try to walk those comments back. But if you ask me, what Trump is really trying to do is ensure that he has some sort of influence after this election is over. If he gets walloped in this election, he always has that to fall back on. Criticizing whether the election was legitimate will always ring true with a certain percentage of this country who believe the political process, as he says, is rigged. So after this election is over, it ensures that even if he gets destroyed, that he can come back and say, well, here's why my ideas are valuable, here's why I was rejected, here's why you should continue to listen to me or watch Trump TV or whatever his future plans are.
He's lined up a few scapegoats. One is the process, one is the GOP establishment. The way he went after House Speaker Paul Ryan is unbelievable. So he's lining some of that up, and I thought one of Hillary Clinton's most effective segments in the third debate was that he says everything is rigged, that he doesn't do well in, going back to the Emmys. And he even sort of acknowledged that in one of the nicer, lighter-hearted moments of the debate. So let's talk about Hillary Clinton for a couple minutes. What do we feel like we know about her at this point? She's obviously moved around on positions as well. I come from a school of thought that as long as there is a narrative, as you got to about President Obama, where people explain to you why they've changed their mind, I don't think it's a bad thing when politicians show some change of heart about things if they say the evidence has led me here or whatever their rationale might be. But she's shifted around quite a bit on some things. She's obviously moved further left. Do we have trust in the things that she's saying? People are saying, well, TPP, she'll change her mind, minimum wage, she's only sort of saying this because Bernie Sanders is making her. How do we feel about where she's at and what she believes in?
I thought that on two questions in the recent debate, she really showed a kind of shameless inability to answer a question that the American people have a right to hear. One was the question about the emails, instant pivot to the Russia thing, the hacking thing, a valid issue, but not as valid as the question of what you meant by open markets and open borders in that speech to that group. And the other was about the question on the Clinton Foundation, where she focused on the Trump Foundation. That's an issue too. But the question of the access that was given versus promises that were made, that's legit. It goes to the heart of what people have feared about her. It goes to the heart of what drove the Bernie Sanders momentum and movement during the primary season. The fact that she still doesn't have an answer to that question, to me, is surprising for such a smart politician. And to me, it suggests that it's not a brain freeze, that there's a real ideological problem there, and that is what's going to feed any vote that goes for Jill Stein come Election Day, and it's going to feed the distrust of her, I think, on both ends of the spectrum if she becomes president.
Yeah. Her inability to sort of explain the email problem, that it's still like trickled out, it speaks to a very concerted effort for her to have this like safe zone for her ideological beliefs. And a colleague of mine, Glenn Thrush, has, in one of his podcasts, had said even longtime aides of Clinton don't really know who she is ideologically, because there's been changes over time that haven't really fully been explained. And even with some of the emails that have come out, one of the aides said, we don't have to align ourselves with Andrew Cuomo's SAFE Act, the gun control law, because there were certain parts of it that they thought were objectionable. Yet when you hear her on the campaign, on the stump, she sounds as if she's embracing it. And the idea that she limits access to reporters, doesn't do as many interviews, enables her to sort of give this lofty rhetoric, and then have these qualified positions sort of that go under the radar, that only come out when she's pressed occasionally at a debate.
I don't think there's any question among a lot of voters, and I think if it was a different candidate than Donald Trump, she'd probably be in more trouble here. But I don't think there's a lot of question among a lot of voters that they have concerns about what does she really believe in? Does she have the right judgment when she is tasked with something that has to do with sort of making a mistake and admitting it, or transparency issues, distrust of being forthright? I think you see those concerns in a lot of questions that she answers, where it's a political tactic and smart often to pivot to someone else, your opponent's troubles. But when people don't feel like they ever really get a forthright answer from you, I think that's troubling. And there are concerns that if that mentality goes into the White House, that's a problem.
Well, I think the problem is that the voters who have been turned off by Trump, for example, and are maybe going to choose to vote for Hillary because they feel Trump is not a suitable candidate, they still have those lingering doubts on all these issues you talked about. Can she be honest? Is she trustworthy? Is she being forthright? Is she just taking this position solely because she's a politician? So that's going to travel with her into the White House. And I think it's going to cause problems in her term. It's going to be hard for her to push her positions because there's always going to be that pushback on her. Well, we know your history. We know that you sometimes say one thing and mean another. So she's already been tagged with that sort of behavior. So she's going to have to figure out a way to get the American people to kind of ignore some of those trust issues, to prove that she's trustworthy, that she can be honest, forthcoming. Some of that, I think, is probably a little bit of sexism, to be honest, but she's still going to have to find a way to convince that portion of the public.
And in our last minute here, Jeff's talking, and I think rightly, about what seems like almost an inevitability that Hillary Clinton will be the next president. At this point, the polls, show, and the election models say the chances are about 90%, right? But is there anything that could happen in the final couple of weeks? Is there anything that could happen in the final days to swing things? What does Donald Trump need to do to have any shot, or is it over? The
Goldman Sachs speech is out there. Somebody has it. That's it. I mean, I think it would have to be something like that at this stage. That no one. There are very few people, I think, are deciding who know they're going to vote, are deciding between Trump and Clinton, right? It's whether they're going to bother coming out, or at the fringes, whether they're going to vote for a third-party candidate or a fourth-party candidate. I think that's the only thing that could cause her significant trouble, is if one of those things that she has labored to keep under wraps comes out at the worst possible moment.
It would have to be the worst possible thing that in one of those speeches, right?
Because some of them have already come out, but it's got something really horrible.
Right. It would have to be the worst possible thing. It would have to be some sort of thing, a Mitt Romney thing, where she says something disparaging about a majority of Americans. That, hey, look at these suckers. So,
or she's on tape with Billy Bush.
Right. Yeah.
The idea that we focus so much attention on the Access Hollywood tape and Donald Trump's problems, we now see that it comes at the expense of legitimate questions of Hillary Clinton. The GOP primary process was so corroded ideologically and on an intellectual basis for so long that it enabled some guy like Trump to come in, and he's now unable to sort of ask really pointed questions. And we're sort of hamstrung about asking Hillary Clinton pointed questions, and there were so many legitimate ones to ask.
Yeah, well, we're going to leave it there. I think that's absolutely setting the stage for the final weeks, and even after Election Day, of really putting her and her campaign perhaps under the spotlight in terms of intentions, right? It's not necessarily going to make a difference in the vote, but perhaps in terms of getting some more things on the record there. Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's all the time we have today. Thank you, Ozzy Paybarah, Jarrett Murphy, and Jeff Mays for being here. And thank you for watching this election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max. Goodbye.